Welcome to a fascinating journey into the secrets of endgame strategy. In this game, we'll uncover a rich and instructive battle that illustrates the essence of positional chess. You'll learn how to fight for the initiative in the endgame by gradual accumulation of positional advantages and the precise techniques required to convert these advantages into victory. I'll also challenge you to pause the video in critical positions and find the best moves yourself, testing your endgame skills and sharpening your understanding. So let's dive into this strategic masterpiece. The game was played between Mark Taimanov and Wolfgang Ullmann. Taimanov starts with d4, Ullmann plays the Grünfeld defense, but very soon the game will transition into the endgame. Taimanov goes for the variation with bishop g5, threatening to capture on f6, removing the defender of the d5 pawn and win this pawn by capturing it. That's why Ullmann plays knight e4, attacking the bishop. Taimanov moves his bishop to h4. Now, of course, black could have captured on c3 right away, exchanging the knights. Instead, Ullmann plays c5, which is also perfectly playable, attacking the d4 pawn. Taimanov captures on d5. Now the knight isn't defended, white is simply threatening to capture it. That's why black exchanges the knights himself. And after b takes c, Ullmann captures on d5, putting more pressure on the white d4 pawn. That's why Taimanov reinforces it by playing e3, and black captures. Now white must decide how to recapture the pawn. Of course, he cannot recapture with the e pawn. That would be a terrible blunder on account of queen e4 check, after which white is losing the bishop. And c takes d looks more natural in order to improve his pawn structure. As you see, at the moment the c pawn is isolated and weak. However, after c takes d, it turns out that as the dark squared bishop is on the king side, it cannot defend this important diagonal. So this diagonal is weakened, and by playing e5, black can put more pressure on the d4 pawn and also threaten a very unpleasant bishop b4 check. For this reason, Taimanov captures on d4 with the queen, which at first sight looks a little bit ugly because the pawn remains isolated. However, as the white queen is attacking the queen and the rook, black has no choice. He must exchange the queens, after which white improves his pawn structure. And we have transitioned into the endgame, where white has a slight advantage on account of his space advantage. As you see, he has the d4 pawn, which controls the important squares. Besides that, as Taimanov writes in his annotations, white also has an opportunity for active mobilization of his pieces. He has two files on the queen side, the half-open b file and the open c file, and both of his rooks will occupy these files. Besides that, as you will see, with sophisticated maneuvers, Taimanov will also activate his minor pieces. Black develops the knight, bishop b5, developing the bishop and pinning the knight, and maybe also thinking about possible bishop takes c6, after which, on the one hand, black will get the advantage of two bishops, on the other hand, his pawn structure will be ruined. For this reason, Ullmann plays bishop d7, unpinning and defending his knight, knight f3, bishop g7, Taimanov castles, and it turns out that black cannot do the same. He cannot castle, as the king is tied to the defense of the e7 pawn. If black castles, white would simply capture it and win a pawn. After knight takes e7, bishop takes d7, white has an extra pawn. For this reason, in order to be able to castle, black must play e6. However, this move has a drawback. On e7, the black pawn controlled the important d6 and f6 squares. And now that the black pawn is on e6, these two squares are weakened, and Taimanov will exploit this weakness. So, first he plays rook b1, putting pressure on the b file. Black castles, and we have reached the first critical position. So, white has black has weaknesses in his position, but it isn't clear at the moment how white can exploit these weaknesses, and black's position looks quite solid. In order to take the initiative, white must create new weaknesses in the enemy position. So you can pause the video and try to find how, by exploiting the already existing weaknesses, Taimanov forces his opponent to create new weaknesses in his position. He achieves that with a sophisticated knight maneuver. He plays knight d2, threatening to invade e4, from which the knight will target both of the weaknesses, threatening to invade. Besides that, which is very important, the knight will also threaten to invade the c5 square, attacking both the bishop and the pawn. So the invasion of the knight on e4 will be very unpleasant for black. For this reason, Ullmann prevents it by playing f5, taking this square under control. However, now the weakness is created, a new weakness in his position, the e6 pawn. On f7, the black pawn defended this pawn, and now that the black pawn is on f5, the e6 pawn is weak. And the knight maneuver hasn't finished yet. The knight cannot invade the e4 square, but it can invade the b3 square, threatening to invade c5. And if the knight invades this square, attacking both the bishop and the pawn, black would be forced to retreat his bishop to the initial square, and white will completely dominate the position. For this reason, the only move to prevent the invasion of the knight on c5 is b6, but this move creates another weakness. On b7, the pawn defended the knight, and now this knight isn't sufficiently defended, and that lets white completely seize the initiative by occupying the only open file, rook c1, with a tempo, threatening to capture the knight. Black defends the knight with rook c8, but Taimanov plays bishop a6, kicking the rook out of the c-file, so that it doesn't challenge the white rook on this file. Black cannot stay on this file, because rook c7 is losing on the spot, as white would play bishop e7. Of course, the knight cannot capture the bishop as it's pinned, so black would be forced to move his rook, and after bishop d6, as you see, the rook is under attack and black is losing the exchange. For this reason, after bishop a6, black must move away from the c-file, and now the white rook dominates this file. However, white would love to invade the 7th rank, the c7 square, and at the moment the knight is closing the rook's way. For this reason, bishop b7 followed. As Taimanov writes in his annotations, he fianchettos his bishop in the enemy position, attacking the knight for the second time, and black must move the knight away, after which the rook's way to c7 is open. The knight is attacking the bishop, but Taimanov still invades c7, defending his bishop, attacking the black bishop, and targeting the weak a7 pawn. So what should black do now? The best thing he could do was to sacrifice the pawn. He should have exchanged his passive knight for white's great light-squared bishop, and after possible rook takes b7, both the bishop and the pawn would be under attack, so white is winning the pawn. However, black would get a chance to activate his pieces. As you see, at the moment his rooks are passive, and the white rook is dominating the 7th rank, but after rook takes a7, of course first it's black to move, so after black plays bishop c6 and rook takes a7, black can play rook a8 and exchange white's active rook, after which the black rook would be active, attacking the weakness on a2. The only way to save the pawn would be knight c1, so the white knight would become very passive, and although white is up a pawn, black has a very good compensation in view of his activity and the advantage of two bishops. However, instead of knight takes b7, it seems that Ullmann didn't feel like sacrificing the pawn, so in order to challenge the white rook on the 7th rank, he plays rook f7, defending his bishop and challenging the white rook. Now black is ready to capture this valuable bishop, that's why Taimanov saves the bishop and opens his rook's way. Now he's threatening to capture the pawn, that's why bishop a4, defending the a7 pawn and attacking the white rook. And in order to keep his domination of the C file and the 7th rank, Taimanov defends his rook, rook c1. Now both of his rooks control this file. So black's position is passive. His bishop is also passive as it's restricted by the white d4 pawn. So Ullmann activates his bishop by playing bishop f8 and rook c4 followed, targeting the bishop, threatening to exchange the rooks and then capture on a4, winning a piece. So what should black do? If he captures on b3, of course, white would get one more advantage, namely the advantage of two bishops. Besides that, the light squares would be terribly weakened and white would threaten to play bishop b5, attacking the rook and winning on the spot. So bishop takes b3, of course, doesn't work. For this reason, as white is simply threatening to win a piece, black exchanges the rooks. But now white completely dominates the 7th rank. White has the rook on this rank, while the black rook cannot challenge it, as the e7 square is defended is controlled by the bishop. Besides that, white is threatening to capture on a7. That's why knight c6, defending the pawn. So how to increase the pressure? The bishop has completed its mission on the a6 square. It has kicked the black rook away from the c8 square, and now it puts more pressure on another weakness, on the e6 pawn. And not only the pawn, also the x-ray is very unpleasant. Besides that, white has created an immediate threat. Of course, white would love to play d5, attacking the knight, the pawn, but right away d5 doesn't work because, as you see at the moment, the d-pawn controls the e5 square, but if it moves to d5, attacking the knight can jump on e5, attacking the valuable light-squared bishop. So white must prepare this advance, and in order to do it, white is ready to play bishop f6, activating his bishop, so making it even more active, and also taking the e5 square under control, after which he will threaten to play d5 and black's position would collapse. So to prevent the invasion of the white bishop on f6, Ullmann plays bishop g7. But now his bishop is again passive and restricted by the d4 pawn. And we have reached the second critical position. Of course, white is much better. His pieces are much more active. However, black has defended all his weaknesses. So a7 is defended by the knight is defended by the bishop, so white must try to find some ways to increase his initiative, to increase the pressure. And you can pause the video and try to find how to do it. I will give you a tip. Actually, I will ask you to find two moves, two ideas. One of them is a tactical one, a beautiful tactical blow, after which white immediately wins a pawn. And the second one is a more positional option, by which white would have continued playing in accordance with his strategy of gradual accumulation of positional advantages. And after you find both of these options, try to decide which one would be more effective. So, of course, d5, as I've just mentioned, would be premature. Of course, black wouldn't have captured. That would be a terrible blunder because of bishop takes d5 check and black would lose his knight. But instead of capturing on d5, black would play knight e5, attacking the bishop. Of course, the black knight has moved away from c6. It isn't defending the a7 pawn, but if white captures this pawn, black would capture the bishop. White would capture the bishop, attacking the knight, but after e takes d, the position would be absolutely equal. So d5 right away doesn't work. So the positional continuation would be, as black has taken the f6 square under control, preventing bishop e5, bishop f6, but white has another square from which the bishop controls the e5 square. That's bishop g3. So, taking this square under control and threatening d5. For example, if black plays, let's say, a5 in order to move his pawn away from the rook's attack, white would play d5. And now, if the knight moves to e5, of course, white wouldn't capture the knight. Instead, he will remove the defender of this knight with a check, and after king takes g7, bishop takes e5 check, white would have two minor pieces for a rook and an absolutely winning position. But instead of this positional continuation with bishop g3, Taimanov found a tactical idea. And he wins a pawn right away. So he plays rook c8, which of course looks very beautiful. So he is threatening to capture the rook. Besides that, the rook is pinned, so the e6 pawn is also under attack, so black has no option. He must capture on c8, and after bishop takes e6 check, king f8 and bishop takes c8, white is up a pawn. However, it turns out that the positional idea with bishop g3 was much more effective, because now, although white is up a pawn, suddenly black activates all his pieces and gets a very good counterplay. So he starts with the knight, knight b4, attacking the a2 pawn. And the only way to defend this pawn is knight c1. But now the knight is very passive, and the knight will be forced to stay on this square to keep an eye on this pawn. If white plays a3, in order to move the pawn away from a2, after knight c2, black will capture this pawn. So the white knight will remain passive. Besides that, the bishop is badly placed on c8 when it was on this diagonal. It was much stronger. And white would love to play bishop e6 next move in order to defend the a2 pawn and free his knight, so that it can move and be active, but Ullmann plays king f7, preventing bishop e6, and the black king is more active than the white king. So it isn't so easy for white to convert his extra pawn. Taimanov plays bishop g3, threatening to invade either d6, which would attack the knight, or b8, which would attack the pawn. Ullmann again activates his bishop, which is still restricted by the white pawn, so he plays bishop f8, also taking the d6 square under control, preventing bishop d6. And it turns out that if the white bishop invades b8, attacking the pawn, then black can simply play king e7. And if white captures the pawn, the king would move to d8 with a tempo by attacking the bishop, and after the bishop moves, king c7, and the dark squared bishop is trapped. Next move, black will play king b7, and the bishop would be lost. For this reason, instead of bishop b8, Taimanov improves his bishop. The bishop isn't doing much on this diagonal, so he plays bishop b7. And king e6. So just compare the kings. The black king is much more active. He is much closer to the center. And in the endgame, of course, we all know that the king belongs in the center. So only now Taimanov plays bishop b8, attacking the pawn, but king d7, indirectly defending the pawn. It turns out that if white captures it, then again king c7 would follow, and after bishop f3. Of course, the king cannot invade b7, but knight c6 is possible, attacking the bishop, and the bishop is trapped again. For example, after bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, again the king would move to b7 and the bishop would be lost. For this reason, instead of capturing the pawn, Taimanov plays bishop f3. Bishop b5 followed. The idea is to play bishop c4 and attack the a2 pawn for the second time. That's why bishop d1, to counter possible bishop c4 with bishop b3, defending the pawn. And black has one more advantage. Besides more active pieces, he has the pawn majority on the queen side, 2 pawns against the white pawn. So he has a chance to create a passed pawn on the queen side. So he starts the advance of his majority, a5. Taimanov blockades the queen side with a4, attacking the bishop. Bishop c4 followed, and we have reached another critical position. So white is up a pawn, but black is much more active. So white should try to find another way to take the initiative one more time, because at the moment black has the initiative. So how should white do it? You can pause the video and try to find it. At the moment, white has only one passed pawn, the d4 pawn. The e pawn cannot move forward, as this square is controlled by the f5 pawn. So Taimanov plays g4. After which, black has two options. He can either capture on g4 himself. If he does that, as you see, the f5 pawn would move to g4, and the way for the e pawn's way would be open, and white would get two connected passed pawns. Or the second option, which took place in our game, is to let white capture on f5 himself. But after that, black will recapture, and he will have, see, at the moment he has a pawn chain here. All pawns defend each other, but after g takes f, black will have two isolated pawns on f5 and h7, two weaknesses. So Ullman doesn't capture on g4. Instead, he continues his counterplay on the queen side with b5, breaking the blockade. Taimanov captures on f5. Now black has two isolated pawns, but the e pawn isn't passed, so white still has only one passed pawn at the moment. And Taimanov plays bishop e5 in order to take this diagonal under control and stop the potential advance of the black pawns. Knight c6 followed, attacking the bishop, and Taimanov retains this valuable bishop, bishop h8. Ullman activates his dark squared bishop, bishop a3, attacking the passive knight. But Taimanov, instead of saving his knight, captures on b5, attacking the black knight in his turn. And they exchange the knights. Bishop takes c1, b takes c check, king takes c6. Now black is threatening, as you see, he has the passed pawn. At the moment, the pawn cannot move forward as the a4 square is controlled by the white bishop, but black is threatening to play king b5, and supported by the king, the pawn will move forward and will turn into a very dangerous passed pawn. Actually, it's already passed, but it will become even more dangerous. So, to prevent king b5, Taimanov plays bishop a4 check. And here, Ullman made a serious mistake. He should have played bishop b5 in order to keep his king as close to the pawn as possible. Of course, if white exchanges the bishops after king takes b5, the king will be very close to the pawn and the pawn will move forward, but probably Ullman was afraid of bishop c2, which would attack both pawns, the f5 pawn and indirectly the h7 pawn, after which white would have won the second pawn. But it turns out that although white would be 2 pawns up, black's counterplay will be very dangerous. So, for example, after possible f4, e takes f, bishop takes f4, bishop takes h7, a4, white is 2 pawns up, but the black pawn is more dangerous than the white pawns because it's further advanced, and the computer evaluates this position as equal. But of course it wasn't easy to notice this. So Ullman makes a more natural move, king d5. And indeed, it looks quite strong. The king is right in the center of the board, and it can defend the f5 pawn. However, now that the king is far away from the a pawn, it will not be able to move forward, and it's blockaded by the bishop. That means black loses his chances for the counterplay, and he will get a passive position. Gradually, Taimanov will squeeze his opponent, as you will see. First, he plays bishop c2, attacking the pawn. That's why king e6. Now the king is even further from his a pawn. And now that black doesn't have any counter chances with a4, Now it's time to activate the king. So the king belongs in the center in the endgame, so king g2, threatening to invade f4 square, after which both the king and the bishop would attack it and the f5 pawn would fall. For this reason, Ullmann prevents the invasion of the white king on f4 by playing bishop a3. Now, as soon as the white king invades f4, black would give a check from d6 and kick the white king out of the square. But Taimanov plays bishop e5, preventing the possible bishop d6 and renewing his threat of king f4. That's why Ullmann plays bishop f8. Now he is ready to meet possible king f4 with bishop h6 check, again kicking the king out of this square. But Taimanov plays bishop c7, attacking the pawn and forcing the black bishop to defend it, after which the king will safely invade the f4 square. First, Ullmann gives a check from d5, and after f3 he must defend his pawn, so he plays bishop b4. But now that there are no more checks to the king on f4, Taimanov moves to g3 and he's ready to occupy this square. After which there will be no way of saving the f5 pawn, so Ullmann plays king f6, vacating the e6 square for his bishop in order to save the f5 pawn. But first, bishop e5 check follows in order to push the king to the side of the board, even further away from the center. Now the king is almost out of play, and king f4, attacking the pawn. Bishop e6, defending it, and we have reached another critical position. Of course, white has a very big advantage, but black still has one last chance to create some counterplay. You can pause the video, try to find this last chance, and try to find how Taimanov prevents it. So, even in the completely winning position, you should be cautious. And you should always keep in mind that the opponent might get some counter chances. And of course, the only counter chance black might have is by pushing the a pawn. At the moment it's impossible, because white would simply capture it, but black can play bishop d7, taking the a4 square under control and then push the pawn to a4, to a3, and that might be quite dangerous. So, to prevent bishop d7, Taimanov plays bishop a4. Now there is no bishop d7 and the pawn is completely blockaded. Bishop f8 follows. Now black doesn't have any counter chances, and now that his opponent doesn't have any counter chances, e4, which leads to the creation of two connected passed pawns. Bishop h6 check followed, king g3, f takes, bishop d2, the pawn moves forward with a tempo, bishop e1 check, king f3, bishop h3, and to prevent the possible king f7, from this square the king might have taken part in the defense and trying to stop, together with the bishops, trying to stop the d-pawn, but to prevent possible king f7, Taimanov plays bishop e8 check, forcing the king to move to the edge of the board. Now the king is completely out of play. Black's last chance to stop the advance of the pawn would be bishop h4, taking under control the promotion square, and Taimanov prevents it too by playing bishop f6. Now there is no bishop h4, the king is completely cut by the bishops, so all these squares are controlled by the white bishops, and there is no way black can prevent the advance of the d-pawn. For this reason, Ullmann resigned. And now I recommend watching a game where the world champion Mikhail Botvinnik employs one of the most unusual endgame strategies. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.